right. Welcome to another evening lecture with Fraunces Tavern Museum. Remember, if you're joining us virtually and you have any questions during the lecture or would like to answer a question that is asked, please do leave them in the Q&A box. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the lecture, so don't worry about saving any questions until the end. If you're joining us in person, you'll be able to ask your questions at the end of the lecture as well. And we will try to get to as many questions as we can. As always, please note that the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York or its Fraunces Tavern Museum. Thanks as well to the Paul Revere House for their collaboration and promotion of tonight's program. Let me introduce tonight's speaker. David C. Hsiung, professor of history at Juniata College, has won multiple awards for his teaching and scholarship. He is currently writing a book on the environmental history of the American Revolution, with a focus on the War of Independence. Today, he will be speaking to us about environmental legacies, how the War of Independence affected the natural world in predictable and surprising ways. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Hsiung. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Folks in the room, can you hear me okay? Okay, Zoomers, are the Zoomers here? Yeah. Hello from Cyberland. Can you, I hope you can hear me okay. If not, type it into the Q&A or the chat, and Melissa will tell me to move like an inch closer to this microphone. Okay. Thank you for coming out on a steamy summer evening. Thank you, Zoomers, for taking the time to log in and join us from the comfort of your couch or bedroom. And I appreciate the invitation from the museum and all of the related organizations that have invited me to come out. It's been a pleasure. Okay, so I will be asking questions, and Lynn's looking at me like no grades. Yeah, and Zoomers, if you want to type in answers or thoughts, please do. Melissa's monitoring things. This is reminding me of fall 2020 after COVID. High flex classroom, some folks in front of me, other folks online. It's great having Melissa help me out here. Okay, I would like you to think about the words environment and war. Okay, how do those words work together? How do they affect each other? So consider the environment's effect on war. And think about any war, any time period, any place. Can you, Zoomers too, can you think of any ways in which environment has affected war? Give me one.
Fighting for resources.
Fighting for resources. Do you have a particular resource in mind?
Water.
Water. Sure, absolutely. Okay. Yes, sir.
Extreme temperature.
Extreme temperature. Sure. Can you imagine fighting in Iraq? Okay. You might think about weather conditions.
Rain, spark, black powder.
Rain. Okay. Rain affecting ammunition. Rain affecting muddy roads. I can't remember the Civil War battle where the Union couldn't advance on muddy Virginia roads. Okay, I was going to mention D-Day and how storms in the English Channel delayed and almost canceled the Normandy invasion. Okay, now what about switching the words around? What about war's effect on the environment? Does anything come to mind? Yeah. Okay, the destructive effects of World War I, World War II, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, right? Okay, and think about today. We have the images of Gaza and the destruction there. It was earlier in the year, maybe even last year, when there was a lot of concern about Russian attacks maybe hitting Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Okay, so my research looks at connections between war and the environment. So I'm studying the American Revolution and environmental history. And by environmental history, I mean the interaction between humans and the natural world, interacting, affecting each other in a continuous, ongoing dynamic. Now, people have been trying to figure out and understand the American Revolution for almost 250 years. And typically they look at the social or political or economic or cultural spheres of human activity. What I want to try and add is how did people interact with the environment, and what is it that the sciences like geology, biology, chemistry, ecology, what can the sciences help us see? So in particular, I'm interested in energy. You, me, all living organisms on the planet need energy to stay alive, to keep our metabolisms going. And then we can think about the concept of metabolism as it involves larger human communities, like cities, like New York City. How does natural gas, electricity, water come into the city? How do people use those forms of energy? What happens to the waste that's created? Okay. And then, so I think, but besides looking at cities, we can look at armed forces and look at military metabolisms. Okay. Armed forces need energy, like what? Food, exactly. What else? Zoomers? I'm looking at you.
Fuel.
Fuel? Fuel in what form, do you think?
Well,
Fossil fuel.
There is some coal in the maritime provinces, in Nova Scotia, that General Gage tries to tap in the first few months of the war. But that's the only real, oh, you're thinking about fuel, just armed forces generally. I was jumping to the revolution. Yeah.
There's all the wood and they need
Absolutely.
animal feed.
Absolutely. Okay, so you need animal feed, you need work animals. Armies need to move, and they can't move without work animals. So you need food, you need water, you need fuel, you need shelter to keep the metabolisms going, work animals, and food for the work animals. Okay, all of that, all of those sources of energy come from the environment. Okay, so I'm working on a book that asks a few central questions. Okay? How did militaries acquire and use energy during the War of Independence? Okay. How did acquiring and using that energy shape the course of the war? And what were the consequences for different ecosystems in the short term and the long term? In ecosystems or environments close to where the armies are, as well as distant. Okay? You might find that some of war's effects on the environment are pretty predictable, but I'm hoping that what I have here tonight might also be some examples that might surprise you about war's effects and get you thinking differently about the costs of war. So let me tell you about the first winter encampment, the most famous one being Valley Forge. Here's a map of the 1777 campaign in the mid-Atlantic. By the end of the campaign season, September, October 1777. The British and Hessians were in Philadelphia. The Continental Congress was on the run. And George Washington decided to put his army at Valley Forge, which is about 20 miles to the northwest of Philadelphia, close enough to keep an eye on the enemy, but far enough away to feel a little bit safer. He also decided not to billet his troops in some of the towns there in west of Philadelphia, because that would scatter the troops into across the countryside. He wanted to keep them focused and therefore more effective. And so that meant the soldiers had to build their own houses. And they got working on building huts December 19th, 1777. Have any of you been to Valley Forge? Zoomers? I hope someone out there must have been to Valley Forge. And here are some replica huts at Valley Forge National Historic Park. In December 77, when the Continental Army showed up at Valley Forge, there were about 16,000 soldiers, and that would have been the equivalent of that would have made them the third biggest city in North America at that time. So they built huts, each hut about 18 feet long, which for those in the room here is from this brick wall to the edge of the screen. Okay. 16 feet wide, which is from the room here, from the screen to the back of the second row here, and 6 feet high at the eaves. Okay, so kind of imagine this rectangle, wall to edge of the screen, screen to the back of the second row. 12 soldiers living in that space for 6 months. Okay. You thought New York City apartments were small. All right, that's kind of tight. Jonathan Todd of Connecticut wrote to his father that the constructing of these huts was tough. The whole of it was made with one poor axe and no other tool. And we were not more than a fortnight in building of it. Fortnight? 2 weeks. Although never more than 3 men worked at once. Now that said, Thomas Paine was also on site, and he wrote to Benjamin Franklin. They appear to me like a family of beavers, everyone busy. Some carry logs, others mud, and the rest plastering them together. Okay. In total, they built about 1,500 huts and another 500 other structures, hospitals, sheds, outbuildings, all that kind of stuff. So how much wood did they cut down that winter at Valley Forge? According to Mark Breyer, a ranger at Valley Forge National Historic Park, he estimated that over 127,000 trees with a diameter of 3 inches to 12 inches were cut down for the huts, for construction. Now, besides construction, they also needed, as you mentioned, firewood, okay, for heat and cooking for 6 months. Okay. How much? Mark Breyer estimated 10 cords per hut. Okay. 1,500 huts, that's 15,000 cords of wood. Does anyone know the size of a cord of wood? Zoomers? Stephen, right?
Yes, it's about 8 feet deep, 8 feet wide, about 8 feet tall.
Yeah, you're in the ballpark. A pile of logs, 8 feet long, 4 feet deep, 4 feet high. Okay, a lot of pickup truck beds can hold a cord of wood. 15,000 cords of wood, that's the size of a cord. So all told, for the heating of the huts at Valley Forge, it's a pile of split logs chest high, covering more than 8 football fields. That demand meant the destruction of lots of woodlands and forests. Probably every tree in a 3-mile radius was cut down. Okay. For those of you who know New York, you see Fraunces Tavern Museum there in the middle. 3 miles takes you up 5th Avenue to the Flatiron Building. Does anyone know where that is? You've been there?
23rd.
Okay, Zoomers, maybe you can think of 3 miles from where you are. Is that where Walmart is? Is that where, you know, your oil change place is? Think about 3 miles. And if you think of that blue line as the arm on a clock, if you swing it to 3 o'clock, you hit Williamsburg. 4 o'clock is Prospect Heights. 11 o'clock is Hoboken. Imagine that whole area, no trees. Okay? So what might be some of the environmental effects of this scale of deforestation? Any thoughts, Zoomers? Here in the audience?
Animals losing their homes.
It's tough to be a squirrel if there are no trees, right? Okay, habitat loss. Yeah.
Increased soil erosion.
Increased soil erosion. That there aren't the plants, the roots to hold the soil. So when it rains, that soil erodes, goes into bodies of water. The Schuylkill River was bordering the Valley Forge encampment, so siltation in rivers like that. There is, without the forest cover, the ground is quicker to freeze in the winter, quicker to heat up in the summer, quicker to dry out. Okay? You might be surprised to learn that deforestation can even disrupt the local weather, making rainfall more erratic. Leaves suck up, trees suck up water from the ground and transpire it out of their leaves during photosynthesis. And that water vapor is important for cloud formation. Also, trees break up wind patterns, I guess, and then that contributes to cloud formation. And you need clouds if you're going to have rain. Okay? For longer term environmental change, consider the succession of trees, of species. In 1777, 78, there were a lot of white oaks in Valley Forge, terrific firewood. For this image, you might see the human being on the right of the trunk, a little tiny person. So this is a massive white oak. And I'm not an arborist. I can't tell you how many cords of wood would come from this one tree, but it would be many, many cords. Okay? These white oaks were cut down. And 40 years later, the trees that grew in the place of these white oaks were hickories, chestnuts, and black oaks. And chestnuts and black oaks have a much lower fuel value than white oaks. They're less good as firewood. Okay? And people at the time noticed that high fuel value trees were being replaced by low fuel value trees. We have Isaac Wayne in 1814 writing, "The farmers in many parts of this county," Valley Forge's county, "are so decidedly convinced of the change of timber, this succession of species, that they reluctantly cut their full-grown white oak, black oak, and hickory, knowing that these species will be succeeded by some other of a quality inferior for fuel. So the residents of Valley Forge had to chop down many more chestnuts and black oaks compared to the number of white oaks that they had previously cut in order to stay warm, in order to maintain their metabolisms. So clear cutting that occurred in the winter of 77, 78 was followed or led to the continued deforestation in the area around Valley Forge in the decades that followed. Now, in August 1778, 3 months after the Continental Army left Valley Forge, Newport, Rhode Island, saw some military action. In August 1778, the British, who were in place in Newport, repelled an attack from the French Navy and the Continental Army. It wasn't the most coordinated of attacks, but they said after the attack was repelled, we need to do something to make ourselves safer, improve our defenses, improve our military situation, and they needed food, they needed energy, because victualling ships coming from Great Britain were delayed, and supplies at the main headquarters here in New York City were running low. Okay? So the commanders in New York City sent Major General Charles Gray up to the Massachusetts coast with a force of 4,000 soldiers, 11 ships of war, escorting 20 transports. Okay? The goal, improve our military situation and get food. Okay? So starting on September 5, 1778, they hit coastal Massachusetts, Buzzards Bay, I don't know, the armpit of Massachusetts. Any of you been to New Bedford, that area? Okay, New Bedford got hit, Fairhaven, Falmouth, other towns. Gray reported to his commanding officer that they destroyed a bunch of ships. Okay, we're gonna make ourselves safer if we reduce the enemy's ability to get on the water. So they destroyed over 70 vessels besides whale boats and others. And they burned dozens of storehouses filled with, as he reported, very great quantities of rum, sugar, molasses, coffee, tobacco, cotton, tea, medicines, gunpowder, sailcloth, cordage, and more. So, you know, some of that stuff they took to load onto those transport ships, but others, hey, if we destroy this stuff, our enemy doesn't have access to it. Then on September 10th, they went to the island of Martha's Vineyard. Any of you been to Martha's Vineyard? Okay. They destroyed more than 24 vessels there. They leveled the salt works, okay? But they also showed some restraint. According to Lieutenant John Peebles, the residents were told to get what stock of cattle and sheep was intended for the French fleet, which, if they would drive down to the shore and bring in their arms, muskets, for they register here 500 militia, they would not be molested. So the residents complied. Here's this force of 4,000 British and 11 warships and all that. They brought down 388 muskets. They brought down the public money tax revenue, £1,000, 300 cattle, and 10,000 sheep. 10,000 sheep. For you locals or here in New York, or those of you who know New York, imagine the size of Manhattan and Staten Island, and that's roughly the size of Martha's Vineyard, 87 square miles. It took an extra 20 ships brought up from Rhode Island And it took the soldiers 4 days to load up all of those animals. 10,000 sheep. To me, that's an eye-popping number. What might be some of the environmental consequences of removing 10,000 sheep from an island ecosystem? Any thoughts, Zoomers, or here in the audience?
They leave behind a lot of poop.
Well, they did poop a lot, but then if you remove them, that poop's gone. So that fertilizer, well, okay, then a couple weeks after they're gone, okay, so it's less manure for farms on Martha's Vineyard.
Overgrowth of grass and shrubs that would
Okay, so yes, sheep are great at grazing and chewing down vegetation, and certain animals, white-tailed deer, small mammals like moles and shrews, they like higher vegetation. It gives them more cover. They like some of the other changes that if you remove grazing animals, you get a greater diversity of plant species. Okay, so so those voles and shrews probably did better with the sheep gone, but they didn't do great for very long. Okay, hard times returned before too long. James Freeman visited Martha's Vineyard in 1807, about 30 years after the attack, and he reported that with 2,800 oxen, 15,600 sheep, he wrote that the cattle and sheep have indeed been restored to their former numbers. Tough luck, shrews. Okay? What Freeman wrote next, though, surprised me. The cattle and sheep numbers had rebounded, but the whale fishery has entirely ceased, and the cod fishery has hardly begun to revive. I had been struck by that so many sheep that I overlooked that the British had captured and destroyed about 100 vessels, which included lots of whale boats. And if you don't have whale boats, you're not going to go whaling. Over the 5 years prior to the war, the 5 busiest ports in Massachusetts sent out an average of 172 fishing and whaling vessels into the North Atlantic. Gray's raid and the destruction of those whale boats, though, were just one blow to the whale fishing activity. Okay? During the war, the British Navy attacked a lot of American shipping. And what business owner, entrepreneur is going to risk loading up whale oil on a ship that might get preyed upon by the biggest navy in the world? And then you have American mariners. They died, were imprisoned, or they either fought as privateers or in the militia or in the Continental Army. So there was a labor shortage of whalers. Then after the War of Independence ended, you had Britain and France fighting in wars from 1792 to 1815, which further suppressed activity in the Atlantic. So, for example, in 1807, Nantucket, the island to the east of Martha's Vineyard, sent out 120 vessels, but only 41 engaged in whaling, and none of them sailed in the North Atlantic. And so you get populations of bowhead and right whales that gradually, slowly increase. Okay? What might be some of the environmental consequences or implications of that increase in whales? Any thoughts, Zoomers? Okay, whales eat a lot. All right, here is a bowhead whale. Here's a drawing of a bowhead whale. 100 metric tons of tiny crustaceans a year. Okay, that's a lot. That means less food for other species. Okay? But whales also do make nutrients available for those other species. When they dive and surface, they stir up nutrients from deeper in the ocean and bring it up to the surface closer to where other creatures are. Also, by eating 100 metric tons a year, they poop a lot and they pee a lot. And whale feces and urine has a lot of nitrogen, iron, and carbon that plankton and krill need. And plankton and krill are key foods for other things in the ocean. In the longer term, there was a rebound of the whale population in the North Atlantic. And this period of recovery helped set the stage for what some historians have called the golden age of whaling, 1815 to the dawn of the Civil War, where whale oil helped lubricate the Industrial Revolution. Okay? So one lesson for us to think about is when thinking about war's effects on the environment, we often think of war as being bad for the environment. Hiroshima, right? Agent Orange, spreading that defoliant on plants in Vietnam. Martha's Vineyard helps us remember that sometimes war can be good. When humans are killing each other, some other species can do okay. Now let me finish by looking at one particular byproduct of military metabolisms, and that's waste. And I want to focus on hazardous waste. Okay? In every battle, soldiers on both sides shot lead musket balls. Okay? And musket balls that didn't find their targets in human beings probably landed on the ground. Okay? No one went around and picked up those musket balls. No one remediated the battlefield. And we know that lead in the environment is a bad thing, right? Bad? How bad in what ways? Zoomers or folks here?
Poisoning?
Lead poisoning? Lead poisoning does what to us? Pardon me? Nothing good. Nerve damage, birth defects to start with. Lead is bad. Well, how bad? How much lead is how bad? So I decided to look at a battlefield, and here's a map of 1777 in New York, and I'm looking at Saratoga. You see New York City, you go north up the Hudson to Albany, and a little bit north of Albany is Saratoga. Okay, there are two battles that took place there, September 19th and October 7th, 1777. How much lead did those soldiers fire? Okay, and so I did some armchair calculations. I asked the National Park Service, Saratoga, anyone been to Saratoga National Historic Park? I asked them, can I take some soil samples to see about the lead? And they said no. Well, they said no about 8 years ago. Maybe there's a change of heart, but they said no. So these are armchair calculations. Okay, first, how many soldiers took part in these battles? 16 to 20,000 were present, but here are the numbers of soldiers on the two sides that fought on those 2 days. All right, ammunition. They fired a 75 caliber lead ball, which weighs about an ounce. Okay? Americans put a few buckshot in the muzzles, call that 1/5 of an ounce. Okay? How many musket balls did they carry on them? American cartridge boxes had 30. Oh, I'm not there yet. 30 rounds. Hessians and British carried 60 rounds apiece. Now, I started by assuming that every soldier fired his full supply of ammunition. That's possible because there were numerous accounts that describe the fighting as intense and continuous. On September 19th, lasting almost 4 hours. On October 7th, at least 3.5 hours. Okay. So you have all of this ammunition, and you have this number of soldiers. You calculate it all out. It comes out to over 45,000 pounds of lead, over 22 tons of lead. They described the fighting as intense and continuous. Maybe they described it as heavy, but they probably weren't thinking of 22 tons when they thought of describing the fighting as heavy. Now, modern medical and scientific studies look at concentrations of lead, milligrams to kilogram or parts per million. So I had to put this weight of lead into an amount of soil in the battlefield. Okay, so I made an armchair calculation. The battlefield was about 250 acres, very rough calculation. It's probably less, but I thought I'm gonna err on the more conservative side, at least for now. Okay, now the soil there in upstate New York is Hudson and Rhinebeck silt loam. And that's the weight per cubic foot. I took a 4-inch thick, I imagined a 4-inch thick slice of the battlefield, like a huge sheet cake. 4 inches, because if a musket ball doesn't hit a person, it hits the ground, it's probably not going to go deeper than 4 inches into the ground. I also think I got that 4-inch figure by looking at modern studies of lead in the ground where firing ranges, modern firing ranges were the test site. Okay, the natural concentration of lead in this soil is 15 to 40 parts per million. After the battles of Saratoga, if you take that 22 tons of lead in the 380 million pounds of the soil sheet cake, turn everything into metric, you get a concentration of 119 parts per million, or a 3 to 8-fold increase. Okay. Now, maybe I went too far by saying every soldier fired his full cartridge box. Maybe not every soldier did. There are studies of World War II that show soldiers didn't fire their weapons at all. Okay? And maybe someone got killed right at the start and still had 29 cartridges in his box. So I arbitrarily, there's a lot of seat of the pants calculation here. I arbitrarily took 25% off. Comes out to 89 parts per million, 2 to 6-fold increase over the natural concentration. That's still bad, isn't it? Okay, it's bad if tiny particles of lead get into your body through your skin, or you inhale it, or you drink contaminated water. Okay? That was my original thinking, but the environmental side of environmental history got me to go further. How does a lead musket ball break down so it has tiny little particles that can get into your body? Well, lead musket balls buried in soil slowly get transformed into other compounds. Cerusite, hydrocerussite, and lead sulfate. It's just this chemical reaction that happens in the soil. Now, in acidic soils, these compounds dissolve fairly rapidly, and the musket ball kind of releases its lead. Okay? But the Hudson and Rhinebeck silt loams are only slightly acidic. Neutral pH is what? 7, right? So 6.1 to 6.5 is not that acidic. So the musket balls probably would have been fairly stable. And so the compounds would have released very little of their lead. And so lead in the environment is bad, okay? But not this lead in this soil at this time. Furthermore, even if the lead were released in these concentrations, either at 119 or at 89 parts per million, they probably did not pose a health threat to humans because the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, says it's a hazard, lead's a hazard at 400 parts per million in bare soil in children's play areas. Now, the EPA has shown that much lower concentrations of lead, under 119, under 89 parts per million, can certainly harm different plants, different species of birds, our old friend from Martha's Vineyard, the shrew. Okay? But for now, let me keep the focus on us humans. Given the amount of lead and the type of soil, why go to all this trouble to determine the concentrations of lead in the soil? Well, in part because I think the conditions have changed between 1777 and today. Over the past century, a lot of fossil fuels has been burned, releasing a lot of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and ammonia into the atmosphere. Up in the atmosphere, it turns into sulfuric acid, nitric acid, ammonium, and it comes down in the form of acid rain, acid snow, acid fog, acid everything. There have been a lot of studies of the Adirondack region, this part of upstate New York. One study looked at 1998 to 2000, and rainfall in that period had a pH of 4.5, 10 times more acidic than background conditions. And that Hudson and Rhinebeck silt loams don't have, Hudson and Rhinebeck, silt loams don't have the limestone that would buffer this acid deposition. So maybe now, over 2 centuries after the battles at Saratoga, maybe that cerussite and hydrocerussite is starting to break down and release its lead. Also, conditions have changed because there has been more lead deposited on the soil. Americans first pumped leaded gasoline in 1923. And by 1985, when that practice stopped, the estimate is that cars put 7 million tons of lead into the atmosphere. How much of it fell on Saratoga? I don't know, okay? But maybe lead coming from the sky and lead being released by acid rain now, maybe 250 years later, might be reaching critical concentrations. Lead musket balls that were fired in 1777 might now be hitting targets that those soldiers never intended. So environmental history reminds us that in the Revolution and today, humans were locked in this intimate relationship with the environment, with the natural world. The environment shaped the course of the War of Independence, and the war shaped environmental changes. The war closed the door on some species, like those white oaks, okay? And it opened it wide for the black oaks and the chestnuts. The door opened a crack for those voles and for those whales, but then it shut. Okay? And maybe the changes are starting to open now in Saratoga. So what we've talked about today with Saratoga and Martha's Vineyard and Valley Forge, this could be replicated at dozens of sites, both here and abroad, that were connected with the War of Independence. And I think a metabolic and environmental perspective would give us a dizzying array of human actions and environmental changes. And that rich mosaic that we would get would offer us a new and complex picture of the American Revolution and its legacies. Thank you. Thanks, Zoomers.
I would like to open it up to Q&A. So if you're joining us online, please type your questions in there. We will alternate back and forth. Let's see anyone in the room.
A very interesting presentation, something I haven't heard before. But I guess the question I would have is, unless you kind of do an apples to apples comparison, for example, of the building activity at Valley Forge with, say, the building activity to, construct Philadelphia or New York or, other settlements, to clear farmland, without that comparative, I'm not quite sure what the significance is of, well, they lost a lot of white oaks at Valley Forge. Maybe without the war, they would have lost even more with greater building activity, greater clearing of land. So I pose that question, and then I guess a related question would be, is there anything that your environmental analysis tells us about, the battles? Were there limitations on resources that affected the military decisions? Is that something you're trying to develop?
Okay. I'll tackle your second question first. So the book is going to look at 4 types of metabolisms. How does a metabolism get started? How is a metabolism involved in the like the movement towards a battle? How is what is the metabolism of a winter encampment? And then the metabolism of a siege, which is a different kind of battle that allows me to talk about Yorktown at the end. Now I've lost track of the second question. The
question would be what the study that you did of the environmental impact can tell us about, in effect, how the battle was fought, what affected, Valley Forge, and what affected the military decisions.
Okay, so I'll give you 2 examples. For Valley Forge, the quest for energy, Washington sent foraging parties out in every direction, sometimes 75 miles, to find hay, oats, corn, for the horses, for the animals. That meant interacting with civilians. And some civilians did not want to give up their forage. They didn't want to give up their work animals. And so the tension between the military and the larger purposes of the revolution, the glorious cause and all that, and the civilians led to some real conflicts, some real problems. And there's one account, I can't remember exactly who it was, but this party of soldiers went into a farmer's house, grabbed some chickens, cooked it in the farmer's house, ate them, and then left. How much civilian support are you going to win when the quest for energy leads to, that kind of interaction with civilians. And so Washington constantly had to warn his soldiers against plundering. I'm ordering you to get stuff, but you got to give receipts. How valuable were those receipts? Less and less valuable as the war went on. But you can't plunder. And he was worried that the soldiers plundering would undercut public support for the Continental Army, endanger the whole revolutionary effort. For a battle, I'm looking at Saratoga. I'm looking at General John Burgoyne leading British and Hessians from Canada down to Saratoga. This could be a whole nother talk. We don't have time for it. Lots of historians talk about not enough work animals for Burgoyne's military coming south, and that slows them down. I think paying attention to metabolisms, to the caloric needs of animals, of horses, to the caloric demands of horses doing strenuous work. The handbook on horses, like 6th edition, has all this caloric information. I think it suggests that not only were there not enough animals, but they were malnourished, they were underfed, and therefore were moving more slowly or couldn't haul the amount that they needed to haul. And that slowed Burgoyne's progress even more. And that gave time for Americans for militia to show up, for reinforcements in the Continental Army to show up at Saratoga, and for the Americans to have that numerical advantage that you saw on that slide. So I think metabolism in a battle or leading to a battle might help understand the pace of movement, the slowness that they moved, and the consequences of that slowness.
All right, we've got a question from Zoom.
A couple of questions actually, but I won't ask them all. Give some people here some time too. A couple of questions on the deforestation and the impact to the environment. One, if you could explain or clarify whether or how the replacement trees planted at Valley Forge affected the weather or rain, or was it just the lack of trees at all?
Yeah. I don't know the degree to which trees were replanted. Okay, I think there was just kind of the natural reseeding, reseed, SEED of the environment with stuff blowing in from neighboring areas, and certain trees do better with no shade and in the sunlight, and those trees have a better chance at getting a grip and growing to maturity. Other trees have the deck stacked against them. The degree to which farmers, residents of Valley Forge, went out and planted seedlings, I don't know. That's a question I hadn't thought about at all. So thank you for that.
And then just that was actually the second question, which actually came in about how active the replanting plans were. So thank you for that. Yeah. Just to clarify, you mentioned the impact on weather and what was happening in the sky versus the lack of trees. Was that also part of it as well?
Frankly, I was surprised that the lack of trees can shape the local weather. It depends on needing a big enough area that is deforested for that to occur. If one tree falls in the forest, is that enough to change the weather? Probably not. 3-mile radius deforestation according to the historian Strother Roberts in his book, Atlantic Economy, Colonial Ecology. Page 122 is where he brings up this issue of affecting the weather.
Further on deforestation, how are you going to look at how that was impacted by the need for shipbuilding?
Yeah, I don't associate deforestation in southeastern Pennsylvania affecting shipbuilding or deforestation anywhere. Yeah, I think the volume of deforestation is not great enough to affect shipbuilding because it's only during this winter encampment, 16,000 people in one place deforesting that area. The next year, they were in New Jersey and New York. And so there was never a big enough deforestation like the Great Lakes region in the 19th century, just deforested to build houses in the Great Plains. So I don't think it was the deforestation was localized and of short term enough that it probably didn't affect shipbuilding.
So thank you so much for this presentation. It was interesting to think about how communities at different periods of time were affected, through the environment in this war. And I was thinking about also like the indigenous communities as well and how they were already highly displaced at this period of time, but also curious to think about how this also further displaced those communities and affected their own, hunting, and subsistence farming and everything like that. So I'm just curious to know, in your own research and in your book, if you would like to look at that or if that's something that you've come across in your own research.
Yeah. It's probably not going to make it into the book, but I want to address that. New York, upstate New York, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, there is a infamous expedition by Continental Army into Western New York, where they destroy not only native villages but crops, orchards, and timing it so that that they're going to face starvation. There's not enough time to replant. So there's a environmental knowledge of agriculture and seasonality and all of that, and we're going to use that as a weapon. One terrific historian, Rachel Herman, calls this vital warfare, VICTUAL, vital warfare. You want to deny food and other resources to the enemy, or you want to acquire those for yourself. And so those nations of the Haudenosaunee were aligned with the British. That's a kind of scorched earth policy. And it certainly continued after the war as Americans were pushing west of the Appalachians after the war into Ohio and on. Native resistance and Continental Army burning crops, cutting down trees, orchards, all of that. Zoomers.
Couple more. Were there short, intermediate, long-term impacts of human waste sanitary management on the environment? Or were they, the soldiers and encampments pretty sophisticated with regard to waste management?
Okay. Short-term effects, not necessarily on the environment, but on soldiers. Washington at Valley Forge and other winter encampments had to order the soldiers time and again, use the latrines. Don't just pee outside your hut. And if we're going to slaughter some of these cattle, don't do it right near the water. You got to go like 100 yards over here to slaughter the cattle. Okay, so the environmental effects of those wastes on humans was important. Long term, I'm curious about the lost dung, the lost manure. The soldiers needed, the soldiers consumed hundreds of thousands of animals each year. And so if a farming household loses a few cattle, they're losing that manure. They're losing that fertilizer, and they're losing the muscle power for plowing and perhaps the milk, the dairy products. So a kind of long-term effect on the environment, not of the battlefield, but of the cow's home.
Another question on part of the lead study. Were any of the lands or battlefields that you looked at, would they have been plowed as farmland by farmers who would have taken some of the lead out of the soil?
So at Saratoga, the battlefield was known as Freeman's Farm, John Freeman's Farm. I think he was a loyalist, and I can't remember if he stuck around after the battle, because the loyalist side lost. But surely it came under cultivation at some point, not long after all the troops left. So farming it, plowing it, maybe I should keep that 4-inch depth of the sheet cake, because, or maybe I should find out how deep the plows went. But I have not found, I started off looking at this by trying to find agricultural records, like tax records, agricultural sales records. Did agricultural output go downhill after 1777 because lead was in the fields? And I gave up on that pretty quickly, because there are 17,000 other reasons why agricultural production could go down, not just lead. Weather, labor, people being lousy farmers, whatever reason.
A final question from the room, I think, if anybody has one.
I'm curious if it's apparent in the material you've been looking at already, whether or not there is like development of an environmental ethic around all of these events happening. I think when I think of the like nascence of an environmental ethic here in like on this continent, I think of like a Ralph Waldo Emerson or other 19th century artists, and which is really inherently tied to like the landscapes of the American West and not so much the original colonies. I was wondering if you could speak to anything you would come across.
Yeah. So a couple of things. Washington, he had his hands full with his soldiers. And when they wanted wood, they'd go and get wood. And he would tell them, you can't just go cutting down everything. Okay? Whether there's a seed of a kind of ethic or appreciation, or is it, hey, my soldiers don't have discipline, they don't have discipline in trees, they don't have discipline in using the latrines, they don't have discipline in marching straight, I got to bring them in line. It's hard to tell. One thing though that surprised me was at the end of 1775, the Continental Army tries to invade Canada in two directions. And one of them is you go up to Maine and then cross, northern Maine and southern Quebec, up to Montreal and Quebec. I don't know what would be a better example of wilderness than 1775, that area. And what surprised me is some of the diaries of New Englanders who were on that expedition. They talk about how beautiful this scene is, or this mountain. It's not a lot, but it predates by many decades the kind of appreciation, romantic era appreciation you're talking about, and that is much more common by the mid-19th century. So there's something there, and maybe once this book's done, there's a lot more to tackle. Thank you for bringing that up. I know the school year starts in a month, so a month and a half. So I've been working on this for a long time, and I wanted to get it out by 2025 for the 250th. Ain't gonna happen. It's about two-thirds, 3/4 done. But with the engagement that you and Zoomers you have given me today, I am re-energized to tackle the book. Thank you, and thank you very much for coming out.
Right. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, and thank you all for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like to stay up to date with all of our programs, you can join our mailing list by going to FrauncestavernMuseum.org. That's also where you can find our calendar of upcoming programs. Our next lecture will be on Monday, August 12th. You can also drop by every Friday this month for an all-ages hands-on craft featuring historic tie-ins. This week is Invisible Ink. Thank you to those of you who have donated to the museum. Your generous support helps us fulfill our mission and share the history of the American Revolutionary era with the public. If you would like to donate, you can also do that on our website, FrauncestavernMuseum.org. Thank you again for joining us at another Fraunces Tavern Museum lecture, and we hope to see you all again soon.
So,
Thank you very much.
thank you for coming out.
I think that, terms that